Do you know Billie Holiday, who died with just 70 cents in her bank account? Or Robert Johnson, buried in an unmarked grave while his music later made fortunes for others? Some legends were only months away from financial redemption. Others, like Big Mama Thornton, created classics that made everyone rich, except themselves. From chart-topping hits to empty bank accounts. These are 15 black music legends who died broke despite massive fame, and their stories expose a side of success few ever talk about. Number 1. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. rose from prodigy to global superstar, breaking racial barriers while commanding some of the highest paydays in mid-century American entertainment. At his peak, from the late 1950s through the mid-1960s, Davis was earning millions annually through Las Vegas residencies, Broadway, film roles, television specials, and record sales. As a central member of the Rat Pack, he reportedly commanded 5-figure weekly fees in Vegas, extraordinary for the era, stacked with film salaries, TV appearances, and lucrative touring. By any measure, he should have died extraordinarily wealthy. Instead, his fortune unraveled. The first fracture came not from a contract, but from fate. In 1954, Davis nearly died in a car accident that cost him his left eye. The recovery transformed him into a national symbol of resilience and accelerated his fame. But it also marked the beginning of a life lived at relentless speed. Success multiplied, so did spending. Davis supported extended family, paid entourages, and lived extravagantly. He trusted advisors who failed him, invested in fraudulent tax shelters, and underreported income during years when cash flowed constantly. By the 1970s and 1980s, the consequences arrived. The IRS pursued Davis aggressively, auditing years of earnings and penalties. Legal fees mounted, interest compounded. Despite continuing to work almost non-stop, headlining Vegas, touring internationally, and appearing on television, his income increasingly went toward servicing debt rather than building equity. He was earning, but never catching up. Personal turmoil deepened the financial slide. Multiple marriages, costly divorces, substance abuse in the late 1960s and 1970s, and health crises all drained resources. His lifestyle never truly scaled down, even as the market for classic Vegas entertainers softened. When he was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1989, Davis continued performing despite declining health, driven partly by pride, partly by financial necessity. When he died in May 1990 at age 64, the shock was not only emotional but financial. Despite decades as one of the highest-profile entertainers in the world, Davis left an estate burdened with roughly $7 million to $15 million in debt, most of it owed to the IRS. There was no hidden fortune, only obligations. His estate became the subject of prolonged legal battles, not fully resolved until 1997, 7 years after his death. Number 2. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye's voice defined an era. By the early 1970s, the Prince of Soul had reached a level of artistic and commercial power few artists ever touch. Albums like What's Going On, 1971, Let's Get It On, 1973, and I Want You, 1976, turned him into one of Motown's most valuable stars. At his peak, Gaye was earning millions through record sales, publishing royalties, touring, and production deals. Industry estimates place his annual income in the mid-1970s well into the 7 figures, a staggering amount for a black recording artist of that era. But success came with strings attached. Gaye's finances were deeply entangled with Motown contracts that favored the label, aggressive tax obligations, and a lifestyle that grew increasingly expensive. His personal life further complicated matters. His marriage to Anna Gordy, sister of Motown founder Berry Gordy, ended in a bitter divorce that dragged on for years. By the time it was finalized in 1977, Gaye was ordered to pay massive alimony and child support, so large that he was legally required to hand over royalties from Here, My Dear an album he recorded largely to satisfy the settlement. In 1976, despite global fame, Marvin Gaye filed for bankruptcy. Mounting tax debts, legal fees, and advances taken against future earnings left him financially cornered. Substance abuse and depression worsened his situation, making consistent touring and promotion difficult. Even after scoring a late career comeback with Midnight Love, 1982, and the global hit Sexual Healing, much of the income was already spoken for by creditors and the IRS. By the time of his death in 1984, Gaye's finances were in disarray. Though exact figures vary, he died with significant outstanding debts, and his estate was forced into liquidation to cover taxes and legal obligations. Unlike the image of wealth his music suggested, Marvin Gaye left behind little in liquid assets, effectively dying broke despite decades of success. Ironically, the value of his work exploded after his death. In 2008 alone, his estate earned $3.5 million, and in 2015 his family won millions in the high-profile Blurred Lines copyright case. Money Gaye himself never lived to see. As of 2025, his catalog is professionally managed and fiercely protected, generating steady revenue. Number 3. Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston once stood at the absolute summit of the music industry. By the early 1990s, she was not only the most dominant female voice in pop and R&B, but one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world. At her commercial peak, Houston's earnings were estimated to exceed $250 million, fueled by record-breaking album sales, global tours, film salaries, and endorsement deals. The Bodyguard soundtrack alone sold more than 45 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling soundtrack of all time and turning Houston into a cross-media powerhouse. Yet behind the numbers, cracks were already forming. Houston's financial decline was not the result of one single collapse, but a slow erosion driven by personal turmoil, legal battles, and addiction. Her 1992 marriage to Bobby Brown marked a turning point. As her personal life grew more volatile, her professional output became inconsistent. Missed performances, canceled tours, and strained label relationships began to cost her millions in lost revenue. At the same time, Houston's spending soared. Luxury homes, staff, travel, and extended entourages drained cash at a pace even her income could not sustain. Legal troubles further accelerated the decline. In the early 2000s, Houston became embroiled in disputes with her father's business entity, unpaid obligations, and mounting real estate liabilities. Divorce records from her 2007 split with Brown revealed that despite her legendary status, Houston had limited liquid cash and substantial debt tied to property and maintenance costs. Years of drug dependency required repeated rehabilitation stays, adding emotional strain and financial expense while sidelining her earning power. By the time of her death in 2012, Whitney Houston was no longer the financial titan she once was. Reports indicated she had little cash on hand, heavy real estate debt, and few unencumbered assets. Though not technically bankrupt, her estate was far from the fortune the public imagined. The contrast was stark. A woman who once commanded millions per year now left behind an estate defined more by obligations than wealth. Ironically, Houston's value exploded after her death. Her catalog surged, selling millions of records, generating tens of millions in revenue, and placing her among the highest-earning deceased celebrities more than a decade later. But that revival came too late for the woman herself. Number 4. Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday was one of the most influential voices in American music, a singer whose phrasing reshaped jazz and whose recordings still define emotional honesty. Yet when she died in 1959 at just 44 years old, she did so in poverty, handcuffed to a hospital bed with 70 cents in her bank account and $750 hidden on her person. The collapse from fame to destitution was not sudden. It was the cumulative result of legal persecution, addiction, and systematic financial exploitation. At her commercial peak in the mid-1940s, Holiday was a major star. By 1947, she had earned roughly $250,000 over the previous 3 years, a substantial sum for a black woman in jazz at the time. She topped popularity polls, won industry awards, and filled major venues. Her acclaim culminated in a triumphant sold-out concert at Carnegie Hall in 1948, despite not having a current hit record. She was, by every measure, an elite performer. Then came the legal blow that changed everything. In May 1947, Holiday was arrested on narcotics charges and sentenced to federal prison. The conviction cost her her New York City cabaret card, which barred her from performing in clubs that served alcohol, the primary source of income for jazz singers. Overnight, her earning power was slashed. She was forced into theaters and one-off concerts, while mounting legal fees, fines, and lost bookings drained her finances. Holiday's personal life compounded the damage. She struggled with heroin and alcohol dependency, and several partners, including managers and romantic companions, systematically siphoned off her earnings. In her final years, she was swindled out of what little income remained. Illness followed: cirrhosis, heart disease, and repeated hospitalizations. Even as she lay dying in 1959, federal agents returned, arresting her in her hospital room and placing her under guard. When Billie Holiday died on July 17, 1959, her estate was valued at roughly $1,000, a cruel contrast to the money she had once earned and the cultural value she created. Her funeral was paid for by friends. Many of her best recordings were out of print. Number 5. Florence Ballard. Florence Ballard was once at the very center of one of the most successful girl groups in music history. As a founding member of the Supremes, her powerful contralto anchored early hits and helped propel the group to international stardom in the early 1960s. At their peak, the Supremes were Motown's crown jewel, scoring multiple #1 records, selling millions of singles, and performing constantly on television and on tour. While the group generated enormous revenue, Ballard's personal financial rewards were far more fragile than the public success suggested. Behind the scenes, control rested firmly with Motown Records. As the group evolved, Ballard's role diminished, and internal tensions grew. In 1967, she was abruptly removed from the Supremes and replaced, cutting off her primary source of income almost overnight. Ballard later sued Motown for unpaid royalties and compensation, arguing that she had not been fairly paid for her contributions. The lawsuit failed, leaving her without financial restitution and without the industry leverage she once held. What followed was a rapid and devastating decline. Without steady work, Ballard struggled to maintain stability. She recorded briefly as a solo artist, but the releases failed to gain traction, offering little income. Personal difficulties compounded the financial strain: an unstable marriage, reported domestic disputes, and the responsibility of raising 3 young daughters. By the early 1970s, Ballard was living on social welfare, a stark contrast to the fame she once enjoyed on global stages. By the time of her death in 1976, Florence Ballard was effectively penniless. There is no record of meaningful assets or savings. She died in poverty at just 32 years old. Her death from cardiac arrest, caused by coronary thrombosis, ended one of music's most tragic financial fall stories. Number 6. Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix rose faster and burned brighter than almost any artist of the 20th century. By 1969, Jimi Hendrix was one of the highest-paid performers in the world. He earned hundreds of thousands of dollars per concert, headlined major festivals like Woodstock, and commanded recording advances that dwarfed those of most of his peers. Adjusted for inflation, his peak annual earnings ran into the millions. To the public, Hendrix looked impossibly rich. Privately, his finances were unraveling. Despite the money flowing in, Hendrix had little control over it. He was locked into disadvantageous recording contracts, surrounded by managers and advisors who failed to protect his interests, and constantly embroiled in legal disputes over publishing rights and royalties. Much of what he earned was swallowed by legal fees, taxes, touring expenses, and settlements. Hendrix himself admitted he barely understood where his money went. By 1970, he was financing projects out of pocket, while still owing obligations tied to earlier contracts. Personal turmoil accelerated the decline. Substance abuse, particularly alcohol mixed with drugs, led to destructive behavior, arrests, fines, and canceled performances. A 1969 drug possession charge in Canada, though he was acquitted, kept him under immense stress for months and added further legal costs. Violent incidents tied to intoxication damaged relationships and eroded the stability needed to manage a growing empire. Instead of building long-term wealth, Hendrix lived in constant financial chaos. When Hendrix died in London in September 1970 at just 27 years old, the illusion of fortune collapsed. He left no will and had very little cash on hand. His estate was tangled in debt, unpaid taxes, and years of litigation. While exact figures vary, Hendrix's net worth at death was shockingly small compared to what he had earned, closer to insolvency than wealth. Number 7. Tammi Terrell. At her peak, Tammi Terrell looked destined for a long, prosperous career. Signed to Motown in the mid-1960s, she became a chart-topping star through her electrifying duets with Marvin Gaye, including Ain't No Mountain High Enough and You're All I Need to Get By. These records sold in the millions, and at just 21 to 22 years old, Terrell was earning steady Motown royalties, touring income, and television appearances, an exceptional level of success for such a young black female artist of the era. But behind the hits, her personal life and health were quietly unraveling. As a teenager, Terrell endured an abusive relationship with James Brown, leaving emotional scars that followed her into adulthood. Later, her turbulent romance with David Ruffin brought further violence and stress. Friends and Terrell herself later suggested that the emotional toll of these relationships coincided with the severe headaches that would soon change her life forever. In October 1967, Terrell collapsed on stage during a performance with Gaye. Doctors discovered a malignant brain tumor. What followed was a relentless cycle of surgeries, 8 in total, along with radiation treatments and long hospital stays. Any income she once earned was quickly consumed by medical bills, private care, and living expenses as she became unable to perform. Unlike artists today, there were no long-term safeguards, insurance protections, or substantial reserves built into her contracts. By 1970, Terrell was confined to a wheelchair, partially blind, and weighed barely 93 pounds. At just 24 years old, she died on March 16, 1970. At the time of her death, she had virtually no net worth, her earlier earnings exhausted by years of treatment and the abrupt end of her career. Number 8. Big Mama Thornton. At her peak, Big Mama Thornton was one of the most commanding voices in American blues and early rock history. Born Willie Mae Thornton, she rose to national prominence in the early 1950s after recording the original version of Hound Dog in 1952. The record was a hit on the R&B charts and made her a star on the touring circuit, where she earned solid performance fees, radio exposure, and acclaim as a fearless, larger-than-life performer. At her height, Thornton was working constantly and was one of the best-known black blues singers of her era. But the financial structure of the music industry worked sharply against her. Thornton received only a flat studio payment for Hound Dog and little to no publishing royalties. When the song was later covered and turned into a global phenomenon by Elvis Presley, the profits flowed to songwriters and record companies, not to the woman whose voice and attitude defined the record. What could have been a lifelong income stream instead became a missed fortune, costing Thornton millions in potential earnings. As musical trends shifted and rock and roll became dominated by younger, white performers, Thornton's opportunities narrowed. She continued recording and touring through the 1960s and 1970s, but largely on the margins. Small clubs, festivals, and European tours that paid modestly and offered little financial stability. Compounding her struggles was long-term alcohol abuse, which affected her health and reliability, further limiting her earning power. By the early 1980s, Thornton's physical condition had deteriorated dramatically. Once weighing over 450 pounds, she lost more than 350 pounds due to illness, leaving her frail and impoverished. When she died on July 25, 1984, at age 57, she was living in a Los Angeles boarding house. Her net worth was effectively zero. She was buried in a pauper's grave at Inglewood Park Cemetery, sharing a small marker with two strangers. Number 9. Sly Stone. Once, Sly Stone stood at the very center of American popular music. As the visionary leader of Sly and the Family Stone, he reshaped funk, soul, rock, and pop with a run of era-defining albums and singles in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Songs like Everyday People, Dance to the Music, and Family Affair dominated radio and charts worldwide. At his commercial height, Stone was earning millions through record sales, touring, publishing, and label advances, and he lived like a superstar. Mansions, custom cars, lavish parties, and sold-out arena shows. But the success masked a fragile foundation. As the 1970s progressed, Stone's heavy drug addiction began to erode his career. Missed shows, delayed recordings, and internal band conflict led to lawsuits, canceled tours, and lost contracts. At the same time, poor financial management and unpaid taxes resulted in a long-standing IRS lien that followed him for decades. To cover mounting debts, Stone sold off valuable publishing rights, sacrificing the steady royalty income that could have supported him for life. By the 1980s and 1990s, his catalog was still generating money, but much of it no longer flowed to him. Legal disputes with managers and labels further drained his resources. In 2011, reports shocked fans when it was revealed that the once iconic hitmaker was effectively homeless, living out of a van in Los Angeles while relying on sporadic assistance from friends. In 2015, Stone won a $5 million lawsuit against a former manager, a rare legal victory that validated years of claims that he had been exploited. However, by then, decades of financial damage, health problems, and lost income streams had already taken their toll. The settlement did not restore long-term stability. When Sly Stone died in June 2025 at age 82, after years of battling chronic illness, his net worth was widely reported to be modest, a stark contrast to the millions he once earned. Number 10. Isaac Hayes. Isaac Hayes was one of the most powerful and influential figures in black music. A cornerstone of the Memphis soul movement and a creative force behind Stax Records, Hayes became a global superstar in the early 1970s. His album Hot Buttered Soul redefined soul music's scale and ambition, while Theme from Shaft earned him an Academy Award in 1972 and turned him into a crossover icon. At his commercial peak, Hayes was earning millions through record sales, film scores, touring, publishing royalties, and production work, placing him among the highest-paid black musicians of his era. That success, however, proved fragile. In 1975 to 1976, Hayes's financial world collapsed almost overnight when Stax Records folded amid distribution disputes and debt. The label owed Hayes millions in unpaid royalties and advances, money that never materialized. At the same time, Hayes had invested heavily in personal business ventures, including an ambitious but unsuccessful professional basketball team. When those projects failed, his liabilities ballooned. In 1976, Hayes filed for bankruptcy while more than $6 million in debt. The consequences were devastating. He lost his home, much of his personal property, and, Most damaging of all, the rights to a large portion of his music catalog. For an artist whose compositions continued to generate revenue, that loss meant decades of diminished income from work that never stopped being valuable. Although Hayes gradually rebuilt his career through touring, acting, voice work, and later music projects, the financial damage was never fully reversed. Health problems compounded the strain. He suffered a stroke in the mid-2000s, limiting his ability to work consistently. By the time of his death in 2008 at age 65, his net worth was widely reported to be modest, a stark contrast to the fortune he once commanded. Number 11. Lucky Thompson. Lucky Thompson was one of the most respected saxophonists in modern jazz. Born Eli Thompson, he rose during the 1940s and 1950s as a rare musician fluent in both tenor and soprano saxophone, performing with giants such as Miles Davis, Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie, and Charlie Parker. His recordings for labels like RCA, Decca, Prestige, and Impulse placed him firmly in the upper tier of jazz professionals. During his most active years, Thompson earned a solid living by jazz standards, steady studio work, international tours, and sideman fees that allowed him to support a family and live comfortably, though never extravagantly. But Thompson's financial stability unraveled not because of a single scandal or lawsuit, but through deep disillusionment with the music industry itself. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, he had grown bitter about record contracts, unpaid royalties, and what he viewed as systematic exploitation of black jazz musicians. Thompson believed labels profited from his work while offering him little long-term security. Rather than compromise, he made a radical decision. He withdrew almost completely from recording and public performance. That choice, principled as it was, carried a heavy cost. Without new recordings, touring income, or publishing leverage, Thompson's earnings dwindled. Unlike rock or pop artists, jazz musicians of his era rarely owned their masters or benefited from significant residual income. Thompson's retreat left him dependent on sporadic work and personal savings, which eventually disappeared. After the mid-1970s, his life became increasingly unstable. He lived briefly in Canada and the southern United States before settling in Seattle. By the early 1990s, acquaintances reported that Thompson was homeless, living a transient, hermit-like existence, sometimes sleeping outdoors and avoiding contact with the jazz world that once celebrated him. In his final years, Alzheimer's disease overtook him, and he spent his last days in an assisted living facility. When Lucky Thompson died in 2005 at age 81, his net worth was effectively negligible. Number 12. Robert Johnson. At the height of his brief career, Robert Johnson was already revered within the Mississippi Delta as an extraordinary talent. Known as the King of the Delta Blues, Johnson earned his living the only way most black bluesmen could in the 1930s, playing at juke joints, house parties, and country dances. His peak earnings were modest, a few dollars a night, occasional meals, and sometimes a place to sleep. Even his historic 1936 to 1937 recording sessions produced only small one-time payments, not royalties. In an era before artist protections, Johnson had no ownership of his recordings and no share in their future value. Despite his creative peak, Johnson remained financially fragile. He lived hand-to-mouth, traveling constantly, with no stable home, savings, or legal contracts that could protect his income. His lifestyle, marked by heavy drinking, illness, and constant movement, left no opportunity to build wealth. When Johnson died on August 16, 1938, near Greenwood, Mississippi, at just 27 years old, he was virtually unknown to the broader public and died in poverty. His death went unreported, no autopsy was performed, and he was buried in an unmarked grave in a homemade coffin provided by the county. The circumstances of his death only added to the tragedy. Oral histories suggest poisoning, possibly naphthalene dissolved in whiskey, while later investigations pointed to complications from syphilis or underlying medical conditions. Whatever the cause, Johnson left behind no estate of value. His net worth at death was effectively zero. Ironically, Johnson's true financial success came decades later. After his recordings were rediscovered in the 1960s, they became enormously influential and profitable, shaping rock, blues, and popular music worldwide. His estate later became the subject of prolonged legal battles as labels and heirs fought over rights that Johnson himself never benefited from. Number 13. Etta James. Etta James was one of the most powerful voices in American music. From the late 1950s through the 1970s, she delivered timeless recordings like At Last, Tell Mama, and I'd Rather Go Blind. During those years, James toured relentlessly, headlined major venues, and helped define modern blues and soul. Yet despite decades of chart success and cultural influence, her financial reality never matched her artistic stature. At her height, James earned substantial performance income and advances, but the structure of the music industry worked against her. Signed to Chess Records as a teenager, she later revealed that she was paid little to no royalties for many of her most successful recordings. By her own account, she owed roughly $300,000 to Chess Records, debt that followed her for years and limited her ability to build long-term wealth. Unlike later artists, James had little legal leverage or financial guidance to challenge exploitative contracts. Personal struggles deepened the damage. By the mid-1960s, James developed a severe heroin addiction. To fund it, she bounced checks, forged prescriptions, and stole from friends. Multiple arrests followed, including jail time and long stints in rehabilitation facilities. Touring opportunities disappeared, insurance costs rose, and much of what she earned went toward legal fees, treatment, or survival. Her marriage to Artis Mills, who later served a prison sentence for heroin possession, further complicated her finances. Although James staged powerful comebacks later in life, winning Grammy Awards and critical acclaim, much of her income was consumed by debt and medical expenses. By the time of her death in 2012, her estate was valued at roughly $1 million, modest compared to her influence and decades of work. It was also weighed down by obligations and conservatorship costs related to Alzheimer's disease and leukemia treatment. Number 14. TLC Group. At the height of their fame in the mid-1990s, TLC were the biggest girl group on the planet. With hits like Creep, Waterfalls, and No Scrubs, the trio, Tian T-Buzz Watkins, Lisa Left Eye Lopes, and Rosanda Chili Thomas, redefined R&B and pop culture. Their 1994 album Crazy Sexy Cool sold more than 10 million copies worldwide, generated massive radio play, and fueled sold-out tours. From the outside, TLC looked untouchable. Behind the scenes, the reality was starkly different. In 1995, at the absolute peak of their success, TLC filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Court documents revealed that despite millions in record sales, each member was reportedly earning less than $50,000 a year. The reason lay in a predatory recording contract signed early in their careers. After recoupment costs, producer fees, management commissions, touring expenses, wardrobe, and promotion, very little money ever reached the artists themselves. Their label and production deals were structured so that TLC absorbed most of the costs but retained little ownership. Music videos, critical to their image, were charged back to them. Even platinum success did not erase the debt. The bankruptcy filing shocked fans and exposed a harsh truth about how young black artists, especially women, were exploited during the 1990s music boom. Personal tragedy compounded the financial strain. In 2002, Lisa Left Eye Lopes died suddenly in a car accident in Honduras. At the time of her death, her personal net worth was estimated to be modest compared to her global fame, far from the millions fans assumed she possessed. While the group later renegotiated contracts and earned more stable income, the damage from those early years was permanent. Number 15. Otis Redding. At the time of his death in December 1967, Otis Redding was one of the most powerful and recognizable voices in American music, and yet, financially, his position was far more fragile than his fame suggested. Redding was a rising superstar whose career was accelerating at remarkable speed, but much of the wealth his music generated had not translated into lasting personal security. By 1967, Redding was earning extraordinary sums by the standards of the era. He reportedly made around $35,000 per week from live performances, toured constantly, and owned a Beechcraft airplane to move his band between shows. Through Otis Redding Enterprises, his publishing deals, touring income, and record sales brought in more than $1 million in 1967 alone. One columnist famously claimed that year that he was selling more records than Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin combined. His spending reflected that success: hundreds of tailored suits, hundreds of shoes, and heavy investment in his beloved Big O Ranch in Georgia. Yet structurally, Redding's finances were constrained by the music industry norms of the 1960s. Like many black artists of his era, he worked under contracts that heavily favored record labels and distributors. While his catalog sold steadily rather than explosively, much of the long-term value of his recordings, including what would become his biggest hit, "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay," was tied up in label-controlled royalties and publishing arrangements. Those revenues would surge only after his death. When Redding died in a plane crash at age 26, he left behind a young family and surprisingly limited liquid wealth relative to his earnings. His net worth at death was modest compared to the millions his music would eventually generate. Ironically, Dock of the Bay, recorded just days before the crash, became the first posthumous #1. One single in U.S. history, cementing his legacy and enriching an industry structure that had not yet fully rewarded him.